session, I plan to introduce each speaker right before their talk. Each speaker has 20 minutes, and then we have each of the discussants to provide some comments at the end, and then we will be taking questions and answers. We have it planned so that we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So to get us going on this session, I'd like to introduce Jorge Pérez-López. He's retired from the U.S. Department of Labor in 2005. Since then, he has worked for the Fair Labor Association, first as the executive director and currently as a consultant. He holds a PhD in economics from the State University of New York in Albany. His most written book is with Carmela Mesalago called Cuba under Raúl Castro, Assessing the Reforms, published in 2014. He's the first speaker of the session. At this point, Jorge, if you'd like to come up.
Thank you, Elena. Would you let me know when I have 5 minutes left so I can drop up and not wind up in the last without a wind up? I'm delighted to be here this afternoon on this session on external sector issues. The topic that I want to discuss today is foreign investment and the role that it plays within Cuba's updating, quote unquote, of its economic model. The paper has 4 sections to it. First of all, a section on Cuba's investment needs. The second session about about foreign investment in Cuba prior to Raúl's reforms. Then foreign investment and Raúl's reforms. I call this, for obvious reasons, I call this section Old Wine in New Bottles. And finally, the role of foreign investment within Cuba's updating of its model with reference to China and Vietnam. I may not be able to get to that section. I may have to skip it for purpose of time. But then I'd like to draw some conclusions. Cuba's investment needs. Cuba's investment needs are huge and are really probably the most critical issue that the Cuban economy faces today. This has been the subject of numerous academic papers. Marino Murillo has spoken about this issue. The Minister of Foreign Trade has also spoken about Cuba's need to increase investment. There's a paper by Padel Vidal, some of you know, who is now living in Colombia, a paper that he wrote last year, where he talked about Cuba's investment problems. And he made the point that Cuba, during 2009 to 2013, had underinvested by about 20% compared to what the plans called for. This, of course, underinvestment cut across many sectors: refineries, real estate developments, expansion of nickel production, infrastructure, and that, of course, all affects output in the current period and in future periods. The 2011 Lineamientos has a fairly lengthy section on foreign investment issues. It is it's a well-reasoned and a thoughtful set of propositions, but it's kind of shattering to see the very basic things that they're calling to do. For example, get data to be able to find the internal rate of return, be able to use depreciation techniques. I mean, things that are so basic to an investment situation that sort of makes you wonder if they need to do this now in 2011, what have they been doing up until now? To talk about some numbers, since the crisis of the 1990s, Cuba has, for survival reasons, emphasized consumption and really downplayed or underspent on investment. The little table that you see in here is the gross capital formation as a percentage of Cuban GDP for every year from 2008 through 2013. And you can see that they range from around 12.3 in 2010 to about 2008 was 15.9, a bit of an increase in 2013. this is what Cuba has, and this is all from official Cuban data. The conventional wisdom from Cuban economists and from the literature and so on is that Cuba needs at least 25% capital formation ratio to be able to have sustainable growth. So it's arguably the rates that have been, and by the way, there's no data for 2014 yet because the national accounts have not been published for 2014. So it's clear that, that they've done, that this sector has underperformed substantially in the last few years. The amount of money that Cuba would need, the amount of investment in dollar terms, to be able to bring those rates to about 20 to 21% is about $2.2 to $2.5 billion a year, and that's the figure that Marino Murillo and others have quoted quite extensively. Here, to put this a little bit in an international perspective, here I've plotted the gross fixed capital formation ratios, which are percentages of GDP, for a number of Latin American countries. Cuba is the line at the bottom that starts at 10, it's fairly flat, and goes to about 12 or so. You can see what some of the other Latin American economies, particularly the ones that have grown strongly in the last few years, what their capital formation ratios are. At the top is Peru, 35%, 35% gross capital, fixed capital formation ratio in 2013. Colombia, also one of the leaders in growth in the Latin region in the last few years, again, upwards of 25%. Even Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole are upwards of 20%, while Cuba is a bit better than half of that. And just for the hell of it, I also compiled the gross capital formation to GDP ratios for a number of interesting economies. The BRICS in particular, the developing countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And you can see that in the case of India, for example, the capital formation ratio was 35% in 2012, 49% in China. I don't know what's going to happen this year and next, since they seem to be having some problems right now. But these are very high ratios. And this capital formation to GDP ratios are a very good predictor of what growth is going to be in the next few years. The higher this ratio, the more investment is being made, and that's likely to have an impact on output in the future. I put in Vietnam, which is not one of the BRICS countries, but for the heck of it, and you can see that their gross capital formation to GDP ratio is about 27%. As I said in an earlier slide, Cuba's rate is in the order of 12 to 15%. So it's a very gross under investment in the country. Turning quickly to the role of foreign investment in Cuba, well, Cuba essentially nationalized all foreign investment in the 1960-61 period. There was no foreign investment that was allowed. In 1982, a joint venture law was passed. At the time, the concentration was in tourism and nickel, food industry. One of the problems of the 1982 foreign investment law was that the enterprises were not able to hire their own workers. This is an issue that has been repeated in more recent pieces of legislation, but that's been there since 1982. And the inability of joint ventures to hire its own workers means that the state winds up confiscating about 95% of the wages of workers. This is a point that came up in the conversation today with Mark Wells a few minutes ago. During this period, from 1982 until 1995, when the new joint venture, or the new foreign investment law was passed, Cuba doesn't publish statistics on investment, but through different estimates and so on, I estimated that maybe Cuba had about $1.4 to $1.5 billion worth of investment, cumulative, during the period 1982 to 1995. The 1995 Foreign Investment Law was enacted during the special period. It was an attempt to sort of streamline and increase foreign investment. It included free trade zones, which a lot of people have forgotten. With the Mariel zone, they think that this is a brand new development when there were zones. Different, but that the concept of enclaves was there already since 1995. It had more guarantees for foreign investors. In addition to that, Cuba has signed about 60 bilateral investment treaties to sort of supplement some of the weaknesses in the law, some of the areas of the law. And I've estimated through different means that through 2012, this new regime under the 1995 law brought together a combined $5 billion. These numbers are important, because if you remember from the earlier slide, I indicated that Cuba needs about between $2 and $2.5 billion a year to be able to really reach a level of growth that will be sustaining. Here, over how many years are we talking about here? 17 years, is that right? Yeah, over a 17-year period, the amount of foreign investment is about $5 billion. So it's it's a very limited amount of investment. I'll skip some of the statements by Raul in the interest of time, but the important point is that the guidelines of foreign investment adopted by the party in 2011 have a lot of directives, guidelines on foreign investment that are very sound. They want it to be framed within social and economic development plans. Cuba seeks to diversify the source of investors. They want to prioritize import substitution and attract high technology, prioritize non-exportables, particularly those that have linkages to the rest of the economy, and they want more rigorous enforcement of commitment. Those are all very desirable things. However, some of you might have been here when I talked to, made some comments on Domingo's paper on our session. Those are nice things to do, but you need to get the investors to be able to buy onto those or to actually accept those conditions. Oecd Mariel, the Zona Económica de Desarrollo Mariel, is one of the forms of investment allowed by the guidelines. They're essentially enclaves where there are special conditions for investors. They have a number of preferential provisions on income taxes, import duties, and so on and so forth. The labor regime conceptually is the same as before. Again, the investors in the Oecd Mariel follow the same procedure of not being able to hire workers directly, but because they changed some of the provisions on the exchange rate that is used for this for workers in the Oecd Mariel, the confiscation rate drops from 95%, which was the original amount, to something like 67%. Still pretty nasty to have 2/3 of the wages confiscated, but it certainly is a lot better than 95. The 2014 Foreign Investment Law, I called Old Wine in New Bottles. There was much anticipated. It was expected that the law was going to change many things. It really didn't change very much at all. Mr. Manuel Pallí is not here, but I relied in this part of the paper on an article that he wrote where he said, I think he titled the article, Cuban Foreign Investment Law, New but Barely, making the point that really the law did not make any substantial change in the in the foreign in the regulations regarding law. It still has the same structure as the previous law. It still has the project by private approval. It still has the labor regime from the previous law, and it's a step in the right direction, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination a far-reaching statute. Domingo was telling me that changes to the law are expected. He understands. I think that will be welcome. The law needs a lot of help right now. Cuba's hunt for foreign investment is quite active. Cuba is putting on a full court press. Minister Malmierka has been all over the place talking about the new foreign investment law and the Sed Mariel and other other Cuban officials in charge of the zone and so on. To date, and I mentioned this early this morning, I said to date as of 10 days ago when I checked this last, my understanding is that there have been 5 foreign investments that have been made in the Sed Mariel, and they were Otelsa, which is a Spanish chain that already operates in Cuba and produces goods and services, produces goods for the hotel industry. Rich Meat, the name is pretty self-explanatory. They do some sort of processed foods, and Devox, which is a paint manufacturer from Mexico. And there are two other foreign investments from Belgium that have not been identified, and Cuba Debate says that the investors themselves do not want their identity to be known. So maybe at some point that will become available, but it's not right now. In November 2014, at the Havana International Fair, Cuba released a very well-designed and very attractive document called Cartera de Oportunidades de Inversión Extranjera. It's about a 120-page document. It's essentially a wish list, a shopping list, if you would, maybe wish list is more like it, of investment projects where Cuba is seeking investment. It's divided into 2 sections. Investment opportunities in the Sed Mariel, and there are 25 of those projects, and there are 221 in the rest of the economy. And I haven't done this myself, but I'm sure the Cuban officials have. The amount of investment opportunities that are available in these different projects is $8.7 billion. So clearly, Cuba has big plans, and it would be, of course, very nice for the Cuban economy if they could attract this amount of investment. I go very quickly through a very cursory comparison that I did between the role of foreign investment in Cuba and in Vietnam and China. And I don't have time to go through all of this, but my conclusion basically is that the amount of, the depth of reforms and the facilities, the ease with which foreign investors can invest in China and Vietnam is a lot easier than Cuba. Cuba still has many restraints and a project-by-project approval setting, and this concept of foreign investment having to be complementary to domestic production that are a lot more restrictive than Vietnam and China. To conclude, Cuba is severely undercapitalized. At least between $2 and $2.5 billion of foreign investment a year are necessary to fill this investment gap that Cuba has at this point. Obviously, Cuba has put out a very aggressive, if you would, cartera de oportunidades de inversiones of projects that are available for investment. Of course, it takes two to tango, and whether investors will actually buy in or not is hard to tell. It's much too early to do that. Let me just end on the point of investment climate. At the end of the day, the main determinant of investment is investment climate. Investment climate is an ill-defined concept, but it has a lot to do with legal framework, property rights, how investors feel about their opportunities to get their money out of the country. And Cuba is, in my opinion, quite lacking in those. As I said earlier, also compared to other countries, Cuba does not seem to have the same commitment to foreign investment that China and Vietnam have, which suggests that Cuba is not likely to get the levels, irrespective of many other reasons, it is not likely to get the levels of investment that China and Vietnam did. Thank you.
That one, right?
That's the next one.
That's not it?
Yes, that's it. Our next speaker is Larry Catá. He's a professor of law and international affairs at Pennsylvania State University, receiving his JD degree in 1982 from Columbia University. Professor Backer is a member of the American Law Institute, the European Corporate Governance Institute, and a founding director of the Consortium for Peace and Ethics, a policy NGO. His research focuses on governance, related issues of globalization, and the constitutional theories of public and private governance. He has written on Cuban corporations and cooperatives, the Cuban Communist Party, and Cuban foreign economic policy. Larry?
With that, I've run out of time.
I won't start from your time.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Mr. Wells, of course, is a very hard act to follow, as has been all of the panels that we've had before today. I will try to make my comments as brief as possible, and perhaps as a set of provocations that may produce some discussion. The slant of my talk is somewhat different from most. What I want to do in this case is to recontextualize Cuba. In a sense, it's what Mr. Wells had talked about, but in a very different context, to recontextualize Cuba and Cuban business. The normalization move, of course, with the United States has made everyone a Twitter, and they're all a Twitter not because we're going to see the American flag flying a little higher in Havana. Who cares? In the long, we all care. But international business maybe cares slightly less. We care about this, but what it does do, and what it makes possible for Cuba beyond Americans coming in, is the possibility of making it easier for global business. And as suggested by Domingo earlier this morning, not the penny ante business, but the businesses that have more bang for their buck, much more willing to come to Cuba. And that provides an opportunity for Cuba, but also a trap. Because in effect, the economic and political and legal sectors, the repercussions of the ability to re-engage with Cuba is going to put them in a little bit of a bind. It will create some legal and societal constraints, and I use that in the economic business sense, legal and societal constraints of applying global standards, emerging global standards, by multinational enterprises that seek to operate in Cuba, and some of these may be impossible to reconcile. We'll see. And of course, the projection of these standards within Cuba are going to pose difficulties. We've already talked a little bit about some of them. The labor issue is, of course, a big one. And I'll nod in that direction a little later in the presentation. But it will pose some difficulties and maybe produce pressures for legal and economic reforms within Cuba, or it may keep Cuba as an economic backwater for businesses that may find it easier to to incorporate the Dominican Republic or even Haiti or Nicaragua into their global production and supply chains than it is to have to deal with the Cubans if the only thing they offer are marginal positive values for labor, productivity, quality, and the like. Cuba is not the only game in town for multinationals, and beyond the exoticism and the interest in potentially exploiting something new, may not offer very much for it. And so we've got two questions. I'm going to pose those issues in effect in two ways. How will the Cuban state incorporate or react to these emerging norms, some of which, by the way, the Cubans have been very eager to embrace in Geneva, but Geneva is very far from Havana. And, you know, there's the old line in China, the mountains are high and Beijing is far away. The Cubans have been very eager in the creation of this international architecture for business, especially for multinational businesses, may be less eager to see it implemented within their own borders. And of course, the bigger problem is not Cuba. Again, we all care, but Walmart and Apple and Nike are going to have a problem which is substantially bigger than Cuba, and that Cuba may not be able to interrupt, and that is how they are going to apply their norms, as and to the extent they may or may not choose to move some of their global production or supply chain operations into Cuba. I'm not talking about tourism. I love tourism. But in terms of where money is, where business norms are being created, the big muscled businesses that are now in these global chains from textiles, clothing, computers, and the like. Cuba is potentially a fungible territory and one that may not be worth the trouble, at least for the moment, especially as and to the extent these global norms may begin to have a little more bite. And so my roadmap is very simple. I'm not going to spend very much time on the structure of legal regulation of inbound foreign investment. Most of you folks know this better than us. We've been talking about this and actually talking about it to death since they were announced last year. We all know them very well. I want to focus, at least to introduce you a little bit, to the sources and structures of these evolving international business norms. They tend to be less well understood outside of New York and Geneva and maybe Brussels than they are, and in the corporate headquarters of the largest multinationals than they tend to be generally, but it's worth acquainting folks with them. They are works in progress. Their bite is getting stronger. They're not quite noticeable yet, and they're not quite embedded, but they're working in that direction, especially led by the European Union. And then moving on beyond that, even the Chinese have taken notice and have begun incorporating some of these norms within their own governance structures. And then what I'm going to do is just end very quickly. The most interesting part of all of this, facts are nice but boring. The most interesting part of this is to point out some of the points of convergence and conflict, both ideological and pragmatic. So that's what I'm going to do. And in effect, I'm going to take something that Domingo ended with in his session, in his presentation earlier this morning, the idea that U.S. companies, and it's actually global companies that want to do business in Cuba, will have to play by Cuba's rules, and suggest to you that while that might have been true enough 30 years ago, there are no longer such things as Cuba's rules that may be applied autonomously, and that indeed, in order to recontextualize Cuba within global business streams and global business standards, Cuba is going to have to learn, as the United States is having to learn. They're not coming to this any easier than anyone else. They are going to have to come to understand and come to terms with these new business norms that are being incorporated somewhat slowly by the transnational business community. And so that's sort of where we are. Cuban investment law, I put a bunch of stuff up there. Some of it is interesting, some of it is less interesting. It's not 168 pages, but I'm a lawyer. Math was never my strong suit. Roughly many, many pages. For my purposes, the interesting thing about the foreign investment law, and I'm talking about it now from the perspective of multinational, standard issue multinational enterprises, Apple, Nike, Walmart, and the like, is the fact that there is nothing to hold on to. Effectively, in order to do business with Cuba, you must negotiate deals within frameworks that are fairly well understood, but that will require fine-tuning and negotiating. In effect, if Nike or Apple, one of the large multinationals, want to go and do business in Cuba, they will effectively have to negotiate something that 20 or 30 years ago might have looked like a business-state treaty dealing with the nature of their business to the satisfaction of the Cubans before they can actually go in. The structures are better. Some of the points have been made easier to deal with, but ultimately, at the end of the day, someones are going to have to approve this, and that approval will touch on every aspect of operations. That works well for the Cubans. It does not work well for an integrated global supply or production chain where a lot of those issues may well have to be subsumed in much larger context. So that makes it the law itself much more flexible, much more opportunities. Perhaps you can dead end some forms of your production, but beyond that, it's going to be difficult. Whether companies will buy it or not remains to be seen. I've been thinking through what is the value of Cuba, and for me at this point the value is as a distribution point, and that may be easy enough to snip off autonomously from a production chain or a supply chain, and then negotiate that because it may be easier to transship from Havana down through the Caribbean into Latin America, or up from Havana to the United States than maybe the port of Houston or the port of New Orleans, which is now a pain anyway. And so maybe you're going to be able to do that. But again, you're looking at marginal value added for most of these companies, made harder by the transaction costs of actually have to dealing with the law. This is the Cubans' own doing. They're either going to have to work through the ideology that makes it very difficult for them to loosen this discretionary chokehold, or not. It's up to them. And global business will respond accordingly. Otherwise, what they're going to wind up having is hotels and related things, and that's nice if you want to be, it's the new sugar cane of the Caribbean. All right, so international norm structures, I've talked about them a little bit. There's really, you divide them into two kinds, and everyone likes to talk about this: hard law and soft law. For those of you who are not lawyers, hard law are laws that are bound up in treaties that then bind individual states. With respect to business practices, for the most part, there is very little in the way of hard law. Most countries have found it very, very difficult to agree on a foundational structure grounded in treaty for macroeconomic regulation outside of these black box organizations, WTO, soon to be TPP, and the like. Instead, what we wind up having is a lot of what we can call soft law, norms that have been created, business practices and the like. In the old days, everyone used to sneer. The only people, there are 3 international lawyers somewhere who would know what is going on in Geneva or New York, and every businesses would sign on to these norms. No one cared. 2005, I would ask around, no one cares. Today, a number of Park Avenue firms have lawyer sections that are dedicated to this stuff, not because it's binding in international law, but because the normative frameworks that are now developed in international law have been increasingly subsumed within the internal operations of businesses, and through businesses have become part of the operating system of companies wherever they tend to operate. And there are a number of in this process, we move from hortatory soft law, that is law that seems to be aspirational. You be nice, don't pick on poor people, don't kick old people down the stairs, those kinds of things that everyone likes but no one actually does if there's money to be made, to rules that, for rules that actually wind up having bite because they begin to look like not merely hortatory norms, but legal standards or behavior standards that can actually be used. And as your consumer and investor communities begin to react positively to these, businesses begin to incorporate them. I'm going to work through just a couple of them very quickly. The UN Guiding Principles, which were endorsed by Cuba in June of 2011, is the major new one, and it is having significant impact as it has begun to be legalized within the European Union, not just the member states, but within the apparatus of the European Union itself. The OECD guidelines for multinationals, everyone used to laugh at this thing. The problem is 2 years ago, the guidelines were given a much stronger enforcement capacity through the national contact points, not legally binding, but with enough bite that companies that tend to be dragged into this, especially if they're in the consumer sector, or they have very skittish investors, will tend to pay attention to this. What is coming up in the next 2 to 3 years are bits with human rights components, bilateral investment treaties, and the big ones, of course, are third-party standards, which Jorge can talk to much better than I can. And of course, the biggest one are the internal standards, now globalized, of multinational enterprises themselves. Just very quickly, the UN Guiding Principles, 3 pillars, quote unquote: a state duty to protect human rights, which only states the obvious. States will protect human rights, have the obligation to protect human rights only to the extent of their obligations under international law, which for the United States and Europe and Cuba are vastly different. And so from this perspective, the Cubans can say, yeah, that's fine. I have a duty to protect human rights, as in to the extent I am legally bound under international law, which may equal 0. But that's cool. I can endorse this. The second part is a problematic one. There's a corporate responsibility to respect human rights. That is specified. There's an International Bill of Human Rights, which is the baseline legal norms that corporations, I have 5 minutes, I'll be able to do this, are expected to incorporate, and they're expected to incorporate this through what is known as human rights due diligence. A number of companies, including Unilever, have already begun using the procedures that have been developed by a coalition of NGOs and international law firms, and have begun engaging in human rights due diligence and human rights due diligence reporting, including the ramifications from them in terms of doing or not doing business in particular ways, right? And included in this, of course, is an obligation to either work with or through or against home states anywhere in their supply chain that may no longer comply with these minimum International Bill of Human Rights obligations, which the multinationals now has a responsibility to respect, and they all have remedial obligations, including enterprises, which has an obligation to remediate outside of the legal system. So with respect to grievances in Cuba, right, a big problem here may well be the labor issue. A corporation coming into Cuba and paying the state $100, and Cuban workers 5, not kooks, but 5 pesos, may find themselves at the wrong end of a OECD specific action dealing with these issues on the basis of their violation of their responsibility to respect human rights. The OECD guidelines, of course, we've talked about this. They provide principles and standards of good practice, no legally binding standards. Doesn't seem to matter in the business world. Societal standards are strong enough. But what they do have now, and the big thing for them, is what they call the specific instance complaints through the contact point. 2 things have happened. 2 years ago, the UN Guiding Principles, including the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, was incorporated into the OECD guidelines, and to most states, among the most active, the Netherlands, England, and now what I hear, depending on who you talk to in the State Department, the United States increasingly are going to be more amenable to hearing specific instance complaints about violations of the OECD guidelines. There have been a couple of instances where they've been actually very effective. Unilever had an arrangement similar to the Cuban arrangements in India and Pakistan. They would fire their workers in India and Pakistan. They would go off to a private company there whose purpose was to supply labor. And they would get labor at a much cheaper rate. The company would get a bunch of money for their profit, and then they'd pay their workers right? The employment agency workers, whatever they paid. The Indian and Pakistani workers sued in India and Pakistan. It wasn't going anywhere. An NGO and their union brought a complaint before the UK National Contact Point, because Unilever is based there. And within several months, a global settlement was effected between Unilever and the unions. These things can be effective, right? The other one, of course, is another Indian company, the Vedanta company, decided to mine aluminum on a hill sacred to indigenous people in Orissa province in India. That wound up being brought, again, a national contact point, a specific instance, by an NGO that had absolutely no connection with these indigenous people in India. Over the course of 2 years, they effectively shut the operations down. Ultimately, the Indian Parliament and the Indian minister got involved. So these things can have some bite. BITS with human rights element, this is a thing that may be coming. BITS may begin to incorporate some portions of the UN guiding principles. Third-party standards, the Fair Labor Act, we've got a number of them, either certification meeting certain requirements for production, labor standards, and the like, or you've got these global enterprises like the ISO, the 26,000 CSR standards, which the Chinese have been looking at now actually with some interest, and then you do certification and monitoring, and of course the internal M&E norms. Go to Walmart, the Walmart page, and look for supplier ethics and supplier code. You will have page after page after page of what looks like legislation which deals with a harmonized set of rules that apply all the way through Walmart's production chain. They've effectively legislated a minimum set of conduct which reflect the international norms that may or may not be reflected in national law. They don't care. They'll meet the minimum standards, but they are, in harmonizing their own production standards, they will do this. Most of the big companies do it when they get in trouble, like Apple. They come see Jorge, and maybe Jorge will be nice and save them, maybe.
I wish I had that power.
Yeah. That's right. And if you're at Corte Inglés and you happen to have manufacturing on the 5th floor of an 8th floor, I got no time, I'll just 2 seconds. On the 8th floor factory that collapses in the Rana Plaza factory, you may wind up paying millions of dollars in order to meet your obligations that are not legal obligations, either in Bangladesh or in Spain or anywhere else it may involve. So we've got convergence, just a little bit, environmental sustainability, convergence through BITS or embedding through central planning. I don't see any of these things coming. Imposition by global actors, maybe if they join the WTO and IMF, but that's not coming soon. So I don't see much of that. What you are going to get are conflicts, a lot of conflicts. And I've just raised a series of questions. By the way, if you want the PowerPoints, I'm happy to send them to you. I'll post them. Will the enterprise forego its CSR policies as part of an investment agreement with Cuba? Unlikely if they're deeply embedded in it. Will they forego CSR? Will foregoing CSR open M&Es to specific instances? You bet. And there are NGOs that are already sharpening their knives for this. And Cuban-related NGOs should be among them if they're interested in engaging in these kinds of things. To what extent will extraterritorial application apply? The Americans and the Europeans have already begun to incorporate for external, not internal, but for external application, these international standards to apply to their companies in their operations abroad. Not the Canadians are really good at this. It doesn't apply to Canadian companies operating in Canada. It applies to Canadian companies applying abroad and enforced by Canada extraterritorially, NGO certifications, and the M&Es and the like. So when you put all of this together, the internationalization of law complications for increasing international business in Cuba will be very hard. And in a sense, if I leave you with nothing else, I leave you with this image, which is from the Sultanate in Istanbul, but really makes the point. You've got a moribund system with lots of monuments into which international businesses are looking, but maybe won't be able to get in. I'm done. Thank you. Sorry I went overboard.
Our third presentation for the session will be by Jorge Piñón. He's the interim director of the University of Texas at Austin Center for International Energy and Environmental Policy and director of its Latin American and Caribbean Energy Program. He's recognized as an expert on Cuba's energy sector, as well as on the island's economic transitional challenges and opportunities. He's an advisor and a member of the Cuba Task Force at the Brookings Institution and co-author of Cuba's Energy Future, Strategic Approaches to Cooperation. He's also worked at the University of Miami and at Florida International University. And prior to his academic career, he had leadership positions in several oil companies, including Shell, Amoco, and BP.
20 minutes for us Cubans is just enough to say hello and how are you and so on. So we'll try to move forward. In April of, actually 23rd of April 2014, there was a major report by a banking institution that my phone started ringing and my emails. And then also on March 25th, there was another report, 2015, that also my phone started ringing and my emails started going. And then also El Nuevo Herald picked up that story. And of course, you can imagine what happened afterwards. What I would like to do is there are two parts to my presentation. One, I want to share some facts with you. And then I'll give you how the interpretation of those facts lead to totally wrong conclusions. I'm a business guy, even though for the last 7 years I am the academic community. And let me tell you, there's not much different in the business world to the academic community that you have to validate your data and you have to validate your source. In the business, I would have been fired. At UT, let me tell you, it's not that easy either. So please, guys, validate your data, and most important, validate your source of that data. All right, so now I got that out of the way. Cuba is producing 50,000 barrels a day of crude oil, and that's where they have been for the last 6 or 7 years. Of that 50, this is the country of Cuba produces 50,000 barrels a day. Of that, 11,000 is the equity production of Sherritt. So those of you that do macroeconomic figures and those of you that are interested with values and figures, it is $250 million a year that Cupet has to pay Sherritt for their equity production. So when you do your numbers, the country of Cuba physically produces 50,000 barrels a day of oil, but 12,000 barrels of that is the equity production of its partner. All right, so take that into consideration. Now, what Cuba does every quarter is that they offset that against the nickel business. Because if you look at the Sherritt nickel account, Sherritt owes Cuba money. But from a cash flow point of view, there is $250 million, well, I guess it's about $200 million at $50 a barrel, that Cuba literally has to pay Sherritt for its equity. So, fact, Cuba produces 50,000 barrels a day, but only 49,000 belongs to them, the rest belongs to Sherritt. Quickly, it is shallow water reservoirs. There's about 3 to 5 miles offshore. All of that is by bidirectional horizontal drilling from shore. It is extra heavy, high sulfur crude. I mean, you're talking about 10 API, some of the fields as high as 5% sulfur. All of it is used for electric power generation, even though a number of cargoes have been blended with naphtha and that have been sold to China, and I'll make those numbers available. Again, the Sherritt production. The recovery factor is only about 7%. Now, let me explain that to you. This is extra heavy oil, very viscous oil. The geology, the porosity of the rock is very, very bad. So for every 100 barrels on the reservoir, for every 100 barrels in the reservoir, Cuba can only get 7 out. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. If you look at Cold Lake in Alberta, if you look at the San Joaquin Valley, there are many fields in the world, because of the viscosity of the oil and the porosity of the rock, the recovery factors are as low as 7%. Now, if the price of oil was higher, i.e. $70 plus, And if they had the technology of companies like Schlumberger and Halliburton and such, by enhanced oil recovery, where you inject CO2, you inject natural gas, you inject chemicals, you use a number of procedures of enhanced oil recovery, they could increase their production by somewhere between 17 and 22%. But this is very important. All of the shallow reservoirs is only about 7% recovery factor. Not that they're doing anything wrong, it's just the nature of the beast. Associated natural gas. I don't want to give a geology class, but if you take your pressure cooker at home, and when you take the little valve of the pressure cooker, that's what happens in a field. Primary production is very important. That's when you break the seal, and the natural gas in the reservoir is what brings the liquid up to the surface, all right? Cuba produces quite a bit of gas. What we did is, and what we do in the industry is we take the cubic feet or cubic meters and we convert it to barrels of oil equivalent. So Cuba produces about 18,000 barrels of oil equivalent of natural gas. For those of you that write in the press and that write reports, sometimes the Cubans will use the word petroleum and they'll tell you we produce 70,000 barrels a day of petroleum. All right? Ask the question. Are you talking about liquids or gas? Because what they'll do is that they'll take the 50,000 barrels and add the 20,000 barrels, and that's how they come up with 70. All right, so be very careful. Ask the question, are you talking about liquids or are you talking about gas? Very good business. What they did is for many years they used to flare it, and then came Sherritt, and they built the power plants on C2 in Puerto Escondido, in Varadero, and Boca de Jaruco, and it's a hell of a business. In fact, go into the Sherritt financial statements if you want to see this business. Very profitable. It is owned 1/3 by Sherritt, 1/3 by Unión Eléctrica, and 1/3 by Cupet. They get the gas free, by the way. They don't get charged for the natural gas, and they just process the natural gas, take all the sulfur out of it, take the NGLs out of it, and then they run their power plants, about 500 megawatts of electricity. Very good business. All right. What happened, Piñón? Come on, you were talking about Escarabeo and all of these oil offshore Cuba and all. Come on, Piñón, ¿qué pasó? We forget that the first offshore well was drilled by Repsol back in July of 2004. That's a long time ago. If you look at the 5 wells that have been drilled, the oil companies have spent minimum $500 million in those wells. Remember, the Escarabeo was about $432,000 a day. That's what that baby cost. And that doesn't include the personnel and people that they kept in Havana and the trips back and forth and the administrative cost of the Repsols and Statoils, ONGCs, and Petronas. The USGS is the one that all of us, at least Jorge Piñón has been quoted, that kept saying there is 5.4 billion barrels of undiscovered oil on Cuba's north coast. The day that I saw not only Repsol drilling the well, but the day that I saw Statoil joint venturing with Repsol to drill another well is when I said, you know what, there's a pretty good probability that there's oil. These are not Mickey Mouse companies. I mean, if you were telling me that PDVSA was doing it or PetroVietnam was doing it, I would tell you, well, there's a political message there that they're trying to send. I have been able now to talk to some of these folks. They were very careful not talking to me. And the answer that I'm getting back, and I don't want to get into, I only got another 5 minutes before they kick me out of here, is that the geology is very complex. Now, I was in May in Havana. I was very surprised that I got invited to a meeting by Cupet. There were about other 30 people in the meeting. And their argument is the issue of depth. It seems that there was a debate between the Cuban geologists and geophysicists about the depth of the fracture. There's a fracture where supposedly all of the oil was in it, the reservoir, and there was a debate. Bottom line, by the way, 2 officially dry holes in our business. The other ones were non-commercial, which means that there were hydrocarbons in the sample. The core samples brought up hydrocarbon, but you never broke the reservoir. There was no commercial. So 2 officially dry holes, 3 were non-commercial. Now, did you hear the question that I asked, what's his name, Mark, at lunch, right? What did I ask? I asked about the Eastern Gap. The Eastern Gap. And what it is where is the little pointer? That area. This is the EEC that was negotiated between the U.S. And Cuba when President Carter was there. The only area that was not negotiated was the Eastern Gap. This is the famous donut holes. There's two of them in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a donut hole, which is the western one, which finally got agreed by Mexico and the U.S. in February of 2000, and then this one was never agreed to. Because back in, when was Carter president, 76, 78? Back then, we did not have the technology to go to the depth that you find in the Eastern and Western Gap. Today, we have the technology. So back then, we didn't pay attention. Let me tell you who wants to get in here are the Mexicans. The other ones that want to get here, and this is off the record, right? There's no, is the U.S. oil company. Because what happened is that Senator Bill Nelson negotiated the 125-mile moratorium where there's no drilling. This is the area that was supposed to open for drilling in the Eastern Gulf, but everything came to a stop when BP had the Deepwater Horizon. When you talk to the Cubans will tell you, oh yeah, not only do we have the 5 billion barrels of oil, by the way, we got another 15 billion. And I said, okay, fine, show me the peer review paper where, oh, well, what it is we estimate, because remember, I gotta go. The other way. Because remember that the USGS number, the 5.4, is only for this area. There's very little seismic in the rest of Cuba's EEC. So what folks are talking about is that if U.S. companies can come to Cuba and do seismic work on this side of the line, they can determine if there are reservoirs on the other side. So that's why I call it, is the agreement, this agreement will open the back door for Cuba to really get into the Eastern Gulf. Because if they say, if you have the shells on the X and say, yes, there's oil here, boy, the pressure is going to come for the moratorium to be lifted on the Florida side. Just look at this. You can barely see it. There is the gap. And there's Cuba's EEC. The piece that Cuba gets is a wedge, by the way. Cuba will get a wedge right there. Now, I'm an oil guy, and oil guys always get excited about all this stuff. So please forgive me. Maybe you ought to take at least 50% of my excitement and take it out. But anyway, oh, and here is the Western Gap. And of course, now everybody's moving to, I mean, you're talking huge depth. Depth to reservoir, 38,000 feet. Depth to reservoir in Perdido now is as deep as 38,000 feet. Technology, the issue now with this technology is the metallurgy. Because of the cold and the heat at that depth is unbelievable. All right. But that, by the way, that chapter is closed for Cuba. They're talking to Angola. Angola has been there for a long time. I just don't see Sun Angola coming and drilling. So I just don't see it. We got a $50 market. They're having their own problems in Angola. I just don't see anything. This chapter in Cuba is, in my opinion, closed for the time being. Cuba consumes about 140,000 barrels a day. And by the way, all of this data, as soon as I get a graduate student in September, will be posted on our site, including all of the spreadsheets for all of these numbers. About 93,000 barrels a day of that is industrial fuel oil, basically power plant. I mean, look at your centralized economy of Eastern Europe back in the old days. That's what it is. So that will have to change. You also have very little light products. Cuba consumes 5,000 barrels a day of gasoline. There are no cars. 5,000 barrels a day of gasoline. Guatemala and the DR consume 25,000 barrels a day of gasoline. Puerto Rico consumes 50,000 barrels a day of gasoline. So when you look at a projection long term, where are my sugar friends? I got 3 of them here looking at me. I love by the way, the sugar guys are energy guys now. They think they're still in the sugar business. They're not. You guys are oil people now. Cuba with ethanol, this will be fantastic because Cuba's ethanol production could really supply 100% of its gasoline demand for the future. I'm working with the Inter-American Development Bank on Vice President Biden's LNG strategy, and the idea is, of course, to convert all of that fuel oil into LNG and natural gas in Cuba in the future. All right, so you consume 140, you produce 50, you're short 100. So Cuba's deficit at current production levels and consumption level is roughly about 100,000 barrels a day. All right? Fact. There are the 3 refineries. So the 100,000 barrels a day of crude, more or less, that Cuba gets from Venezuela and Algeria goes into Cuban refining system. Cienfuegos is running about, oh, you're kidding. Cienfuegos is running about 56, 55. La Habana and Santiago are running the balance. Read my lips. Cuba is not reselling Venezuelan crude oil. Crude oil. So whenever any of you makes a remark that Cuba is not reselling Venezuelan crude oil. They're reselling something else, and I'll get to it in a minute. I don't think I'm going to have time. Quickly, electricity demand. This is important. The electricity demand has grown over the last 4 or 5 years from about 17,000 gigawatt hours to about 19,000 gigawatt hours. What's interesting is the state sector has been steady. But look at the residential and private sector. Those are the cuentapropistas. In other words, everybody now, their home are running a little business. And not only that, but now they have more money, so people now have a little air conditioning unit in their window, and they have the microwave and whatever. So look at the increase of consumption in the private sector from 6,000 gigawatt hours to about 7,700 gigawatt hours. Look at this number, guys. Their losses, about 3,000 gigawatt hours. That's something like what, 12, 15%? In the US, it's about 5%. The reason is the transmission lines and all the distribution systems. I mean, so if Cuba could just really invest the money in transmission, distribution, and even in some of their power production, this number could go down to what ought to be between 5 or 6%. All right, and this is what they're burning. They're burning mostly in the big thermoelectric power plants. They're burning oil. They have this diversified distribution generators, which is also oil. And then, where are my sugar friends? About 4% is only bagasse from biomass. That could be huge. All right? If Anillo, Sanchez, and Messina, if the 3 of them can get together and figure something out, and Cuba could bring back 750,000 hectares of production into sugarcane, that number could be huge.
6,000 giga.
There you go. I knew he had the answer somewhere. All right, now, quickly, to understand then why are some researchers and folks just take the numbers and just run with it. It is very complex. It is not easy. It's like you have to put the puzzle together. You have to validate your data. We have five different filters that one of our students goes through to validate the data from ONE. You have to do that because otherwise, it's not done right. We have to do it. Cuban Petrol owns Cienfuegos. Cienfuegos is a refinery that is owned by Oecd and PDVSA, 51%, 49%. So there is a business entity there. So when you look at exports and when you look at imports, you have to look at the owners of the asset. Yes, the asset happens to be located on the island of Cuba. So we report the island of Cuba or the country of Cuba did this and that. But under whose account? Okay, which is what I look at. Sure, people give me the macro numbers for the island of Cuba, but what I go, how much was Oecd, how much was Cuban Petrol, how much were the trading companies that are doing blending in Cuba? That's what you have to look at in order to understand the business. What happens is that the Venezuelan volume, PDVSA is the entity that delivers the barrels to Cuba. it goes into the joint venture takes title, the joint venture processes the barrel, and then Cuba takes its offtake. And the offtake for Cuba is the 90 to 95,000 barrels a day of product. So when Cuba takes the offtake of the barrels from Venezuela, it's not a crude oil offtake, because the crude oil offtake is being managed by a joint venture, it is a product offtake. And then the balance is export. They're doing a lot of blending in Cienfuegos, and that's what has everybody messed up. And what, oh, well, these are the barrels that PDVSA and Cuba report as far as the imports of crude. And this is the breakdown for Cuba under the CIC agreement. As you can see, it's not only crude oil, but also products. I don't have the data that tells me how many tankers came in first half of June versus second half of July. I have the price formula, but I just can't apply the price formula. So all that I have is an annualized number. Because I don't know how many cargoes came in 1 month versus another month. So all that I have is an annualized number. When I take the CIC border agreement, it tells me that over 2003, by the way, I don't take a look at the first 3 years. 2003 was after the PDVSA strike, and that's when the rules became changed. That's the value, the total value of the crude oil, the estimated value of the crude oil delivered by Venezuela to Cuba over the last, 10 years is $26 billion. Market value, $26 billion. If you look at the agreement, 14 billion is short term, and the rest is long term. Now, look what one of my students found. I love it. You have to read the fine print, guys. You have to read the fine print. Page 123 of the Venezuela's annual report. Now, I need to borrow 2 seconds from somebody. Read this, because this is where this is really discovered. A partir de 2008, el esquema de venta fue modificado facturándose, invoicing, facturándose, solo a la parte a corto plazo, in other words, the 90-day portion. All right? Cuyos montos, whose amount, are offset by the medical services under Barrio Adentro 3. So what that means is what we have known for quite a while, that Cuba doesn't pay anything for its oil. Okay, so from a cash flow position, it is free. Now, the question that you guys, economists, have to find out, because I haven't been able to find out, is the long-term debt, which is today $12 billion, has that been written off by Venezuela? But the short-term debt, it's gone. I know, you're even getting up to get me out of here. Let me finish up. Let me finish.
Don't give him a break.
No.
We need discussants.
These are the quotes. Moody says that Cuba's debt was $6 billion of oil. Is wrong. There was the Venezuela report from Barclays that said that Venezuela wasn't delivering crude to Cuba. It's wrong because they're delivering it now from Bull Bay. I talked to Carmen Salado. I couldn't believe this. Carmen Salado, in his paper at the Real Instituto del Tenor de Madrid, is predicting that by 2015, there's going to be a crude oil deficit of 40%. Carmelo says I'll have to check and see. And then just recently, Pavel Vidal said that the 50,000 barrels, which is what I told you was Cuban production, Pavel Vidal says, no, that's coming from Venezuela, and the value of that is 1.2 billion. So again, all that I'm saying is that you have to understand the data. You have to take a look at honest statistics. These are the new tanks in Santiago. These are the new tanks in Matanzas where they're doing the blending. So again, the message is please look at the data, validate your sources, because it's just wrong interpretation and everybody's getting the wrong idea, and then the Nuevo Herald picks it up in its front page and wrong message is being sent. So.
We've had some excellent talks on investments and energy, and at this point, I'd like to invite Luis to come up for the discussion section. Luis, come up, please. And I'd like to introduce our two discussants, Brian and Luis, first on the discussion section side. Brian Roberts is a senior economist at Econometrica. Dr. Roberts was previously the Assistant Director for Border and Immigration Programs at the Department of Homeland Security. Before working for DHS, Dr. Roberts was an economic advisor in several countries of the former Soviet Union and the Balkans. He has been an assistant professor at the University of Miami and an adjunct faculty at George Washington University. He holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and PhD in economics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Luis is an international economist in Boston and a founding member of ASCE. He has taught international economics at universities in the US, South America, and Europe. He was chief economist at the Organization of American States, director of Latin American Department at the Institute of International Finance, and head of international economics at banks in San Francisco and London. I'd like to turn it over to both discussants. Brian, if you'd like to go first, or Luis, I'll let you decide. Thank you.
Okay. Does this work? Let me just begin by saying I did bring formal clothes with me, and I was going to wear my favorite silk shirt and suit, but I put the silk shirt into dry cleaning at the hotel, and they dry cleaned it as a cotton shirt. So I'm wearing the Guiabera as testament to my love for the shirt, respect for Cuban culture, and protest against the imbecilic services of a certain multinational enterprise. So the two presentations were very thorough, and I learned a lot from both of them. They were different and yet had many synergies. And I'd like to begin with an observation and then just ask a few questions. My observation is that everything that I read in both presentations convinced me of a continued determination of the Cuban government to have complete control over economic activity outside of a limited private sector. So it seems that Cuba, in my mind, is still quite close to Hungary 1968 or even the USSR in 1990. And I can't help but think of an article by Andrei Schleifer and Robert Vishny that was published in 1992 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It talks about the perils of partial reform, the pressures for continued change or retrenchment, and how the Cuban government has retrenched at every point in response to those perils and pressures. And yet they seem to be taking steps now that guarantee that these pressures are going to emerge and intensify. One that catches my eye is pushing hundreds of thousands of people into a private sector that they're constraining on what seems to be almost every important margin. So this leads me to wonder if the regime could change very suddenly once the Castro brothers move on from playing God to perhaps actually meeting God. And it seems that with respect to foreign direct investment, we have growing interest from the outside of Cuba and a regime that's determined to play by its own rules, even treating FDI as a component of their 5-year plan, which I must say is just astonishing. Specific questions. Jorge, you documented the investment to GDP ratio very well and looked at Cuba in a cross-country context. And I was wondering if you've also looked at foreign direct investment in a cross-country context and how Cuba compares to its peers. And that seems like something that could actually, some useful statistical analysis could be done on that in a panel data context. I've done research like that myself in the past, and it would seem perhaps an interesting opportunity if the data's there. A question for both presenters is, my own experience has been primarily in Eastern Europe and the former USSR. And for some countries in that group, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, arguably the single most important outcome of FDI inflows and multinational activity has been that these countries have become part of the German economy's supply chain. It's very, very tangible in Poland, which is a country I married into and am in quite frequently, and I can see, even on the ground level, the ramifications of that. Pick up the latest IMF staff country report on Poland, and that's exactly its primary focus is on understanding Poland as a component of the German supply chain. There are countries in that group that have not done so well in terms of integrating into German supply chains or other countries' supply chains. And so I have to wonder, is the European future analogy to Cuba Poland, or will it be Greece? What supply chains could Cuba conceivably integrate into in the future when things really start to change? And a final question for Larry. I really learned a lot about the governance frameworks, and what was the term? The international norm?
Yeah.
I had heard of a couple of them, I hadn't heard of others. But what I wonder is, what do we actually know about these frameworks' real impacts on decisions and outcomes? How are they actually affecting the decisions of entities doing business, making investments, and the economic and social outcomes that they're intended to affect? Thank you.
Thank you. I will comment first on Jorge Piñón's comments and papers on the basis of his talk and notes that he kindly furnished us. I should start by saying that Jorge Piñón's writings on Cuba are the gold standard reference on the topic. And there are, I think, three mysteries that they help to solve. And the first mystery is what about Cuban oil exports? Because they do show mirror data when you look at data from the IMF on direction of trade. You can see that there's some peculiar imports from Cuba. They're refined products, and they go to African countries, for instance. So I think something's going on, and Jorge helps this by getting a residual, looking at Cuban refinery production and consumption and so forth, and get some residual to explain some of this. The second mystery is the financing of Venezuelan imports, and this we all have read the PDVSA reports, which pretty well say what we've been saying for many years, that essentially there is no net effect on Venezuelan imports from Cuba. They are essentially net off from the Cuban services that are provided to Venezuela, and that this pricing is very flexible, so the net change is around zero. This applies to the debt, by the way. I think that either the Central Bank of Venezuela and the PDVSA balance sheets do not show any debt that can be attributed to Cuba. They do show debt to Venezuela from Central America and the other countries in the oil scheme. But these are not, the total is actually, I forget, in the order of $3-4 billion, and couldn't possibly include much from Cuba. Now, the third mystery is what about, and I think that Jorge implied this at the beginning, is the Venezuelan crisis in Cuba. The Barclays Bank report saying that Cuban exports, Venezuelan exports to Cuba were cut by a huge amount, by 50,000 barrels or something, and there's no evidence of this, and independent sources in Venezuela state they have no knowledge of this, that they believe that the flow is pretty much roughly what it has been in the last 2 or 3 years, that is around 98,000 barrels per day of crude oil. Now I have some comments about points, and one is a question is about Venezuelan oil-related investments. PDVSA had some projects in Cuba expanding refineries, and the last PDVSA annual report mentioned that these projects were in this stage of appraisal and this and that and the other, but we haven't seen any movement. And this is the single most important component of foreign direct investment in Cuba, by the way, which would be the Venezuelan component of these oil projects, so they are fairly important. Second, another point is about Sherrid. Sherrid is very interesting because I think that Jorge quotes, Sherrid has to be paid for equity. Yes, but they are not paid. And you can look at the Sherrid annual reports, which I have looked, and they've had arrears from Cuba. after the crisis in 2008, 2009, sheriff was not paid. They carried it in their balance sheet as a Cuban obligation that wasn't paid. It was settled in the last 2 years. And this is something that investors will, of course, notice, that sheriff is the single most important foreign investor in Cuba. And they're having arrears. Now they were settled, I believe, as far as I know, but yes. But that's a shared point. So this comes to the point of Jorge's paper that the investment climate is important, but I like to summarize it as risk adjustment returns. In other words, investors go to places where they get the right risk adjusted return, and this return has to be allowed and calculated on the basis of economic risks that are maybe to policy or to price controls or to whatever management, marketing arrangements and so forth. A sixth point is for electricity. I used to run in my investment career a power fund that invested in Latin American electricity. And actually I was surprised that the transmission loss in Cuba is only 15%. Because remember in Argentina it was over 30%. Because people were tapping on the lines and getting power off and light in their houses. And in Nicaragua, they were way over 20%. I forget the exact number. So Cuba at 15% is actually doing well. And if they get it to 5%, that would be wonderful. All right, this is all I had to say. I had another comment on Jorge's paper that when you have the GDP ratios, the investment to GDP ratio, I think you use constant prices. I believe they're on constant price. But in Cuba, there's a huge difference between constant and current prices because relative price of investment goods have really changed dramatically in the last 10, 15 years. So in other words, the price of capital goods has increased relatively to the price of other goods. So essentially, the ratios are a lot lower when you look at current prices. But for today and for forecasting, you need to look at current prices because you're not buying the capital goods of 10 years ago. You're buying them of today. So it makes a huge difference in Cuba, by the way.
I'll take a look at it.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it. Thanks.
We started 8 minutes late. We are officially at 4:15. I'm going to ask that we continue for an additional 8 minutes to make it fair so that we have time for question and answer from the audience. So go ahead.
Awesome.
Good afternoon, Sylvia Garrigo I'm a retired Chevron executive, and my questions or thoughts are directed to, I guess, both Larry and Jorge. And when you talked about corporate responsibility and social environmentally responsible behavior in Cuba, as a former representative of a multinational enterprise, the word that just stuck out in my mind was complicit. What? Complicit. And, we've operated in very difficult operating environments where we've been accused of being complicit in human rights or labor violations. And so if you have an environment where there's no legal framework, so you have no sanctity of contract, you don't have the administration of justice, so a multinational enterprise would not have access to remedies. You have global voluntary standards, which on their face are voluntary. And then most of all, you have no transparency by the Cuban government. All of these things being essential elements of social and environmental responsibility. There's no transparency on even I think there was a 70-something%, which they now take from the labor force, on how those funds are going to be used for the benefit of the population or the people. So what levers do you think exist, apart from just pure profits, but what levers do you think exist in Cuba to get the Cuban government to think on adopting the socially and environmentally responsible business practice? I know they adopted the UNGPs, but they've already violated that. So thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Who would like to answer?
Can we answer the comments? Because there were a number of issues from Luis. Quick,
Sure.
right?
Okay, if we can make it quick, because we have 8
Okay,
minutes
no,
and there's nothing for the audience right now.
slides 20, 21, and 22, which I didn't have time to go through, answers the blending and the export question that Luis had. And what it is that Cuba is blending oil. And blending operations in most countries in the world is a bonded operation. In the Bahamas today, you have the largest oil terminal in the world in Freeport, 22 million barrels. There's a huge blending operation that never goes into the national accounts of the Bahamas. So when Moody's looks at the data, Cuba mistakenly took the oil that's coming in for blending operations and reported it in their figures, and that's why they take that number. And you are correct, and on this slide, I have all the Comtrade information. That is blended product. It is not crude oil, it is blended product, and it's owned by third parties. Cuba is just the country, the import of record. Your second comment on the Venezuelan projects, they're all dead. There's no Venezuelan project as far as building. And share arrears, I thought that was already, I'll take a look at it, but I thought those were already settled. Okay, all right.
Just very fast. The answer is, yeah, they still can't get over central planning, but they're trying, they're really conflicted. It's not clear which way it's going to go. Greece, not Poland, for all kinds of reasons, but Greece, not Poland. And the real effect is erratic. It's tentative, depends on the industrial sector, including, but now with a focus on the extractive industries, especially mining in Asia and Latin America. But it's growing, especially for European multinationals that are now being subject more and more to EU transparency rules. Your question. Yes, complicity. Complicity was a big factor in the standards that are being set up. They're trying to put teeth in it. There are negotiations now for a new comprehensive treaty that was also supported, a new comprehensive business and human rights treaty, which is also supported by Cuba, although now they're putting roadblocks in. It's not going to happen in our lifetime. The answer is there may be, at the gross violations of human rights, companies may well be, complicity may be enough to bring them in, but that's a really hard sell. The Kiobel case killed complicity in the United States, which is the only place where you could get courts. Everyone is scrambling for something else, and that something else now appears to be transparency regimes, and then focusing on the control of investment markets and consumers. It's a complicated business, but again, a work in progress.
Jorge, would you like to respond?
Well, on Brian's points, I don't have in this paper the performance of foreign investment. It's hard to get statistics that are comparable on foreign investment across countries. UNCTAD has a series, an annual publication, and CEPAL does too. If you look at Cuba, the figures that they give are vastly different, and they do not concord with anything that you get from the literature. But I think I gave a couple of cumulative periods how much investment there was. I think I had $5 billion over a 17-year period. I can't do the math on my head anymore, but I think that's less than $300 million a year of investment. So investment flows into Cuba are very, 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 very small. If you look at other countries in the region, Central America, Mexico, Colombia, I don't have that in my paper, but they're much, much higher investment flows.
Per capita?
Even on per capita, yeah, per capita or global, yeah, sure, per capita as well.
I think we have time
That's something that I will add in the paper.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question, and that's it.
Thank you. Two very small questions, really quick. Number one, Piñón, future of offshore drilling in Cuba. Second, there's a lot of talk, a lot of speculation that Venezuela might sell down the river, Cuba not providing any more oil. Comments on that, please.
The offshore chapter is closed, even though Cabrizas came back from Luanda and said that Sonangol is going to do something in 2017, highly unlikely. On the, your second question is politically, it would be a big negative point for Venezuela to say that we can no longer supply our Cuban friends. I believe that Venezuela will risk their own nation and the survival of their own country and their own people just to keep that optics that we will continue to supply crude to Venezuela. By the way, what's going on is that that crude now is coming not only from Puerto La Cruz, but it's coming also from Bull Bay and Bonaire, where there's new blending facilities there. So yes, there are less ships going from Venezuela to Cuba, but Venezuela is supplying that deficit from Bull Bay and Bonaire. So there's no short deliveries of Venezuela to oil by Cuba that we have seen so far.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to thank the panel and the audience. Thank you very much. Session is closed.